I'll defer to you, Banyan, when...
Recording in progress.
Mr. Chairman, I believe we are good to go, sir.
All right. Thank you. Good to go. Fresh and fond to me for my father-in-law, who was a World War II pilot. So good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're ready to begin. I will count down from 5, then we will start. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The Subcommittee on Health, Employment, Labor, and Pensions will come to order. Welcome again, everyone. I note that a quorum is present. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on examining pathways to build a stronger, more inclusive retirement system for Americans. This is an entirely remote hearing, and as such, the committee's hearing room is officially closed. All microphones will be kept muted as a general rule to avoid unnecessary background noise. Members and witnesses will be responsible for unmuting themselves when they are recognized to speak or when they wish to seek recognition. If a member or witness experiences technical difficulties during the hearing, please stay connected on the platform. Make sure you are muted and use your phone to immediately call the committee's IT director, whose number was provided in advance. Should the chair experience technical difficulty or need to step away, my distinguished colleague, Mr. Levine from Michigan, or another majority member is hereby authorized to assume the gavel in my absence. In order to ensure that the committee's 5-minute rule is adhered to, staff will be keeping track of time using the committee's field timer, which appears in its own thumbnail's picture and will show a blinking light when time is up. Pursuant to Committee Rule 8C, opening statements are limited to the chair and ranking member. I recognize myself now for the purpose of making an opening statement. Today, we are meeting to explore the strengths, challenges, and inequities of America's retirement system, as well as to review HR 2954, the Securing a Strong Retirement Act of 2021, which is known as the Secure Act 2.0. This bill includes important provisions in the Education and Labor Committee's jurisdiction. Earlier this year, congressional Democrats and the administration addressed the urgent multi-employer pension crisis and fully protected the pensions of more than 1 million Americans. Our solution was broadly supported by key stakeholders, including hundreds of employers and the United States Chamber of Commerce. Had we not acted, the unacceptable status quo would have continued, plans would have failed, and the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation would have become insolvent. If that had happened, workers and retirees would lose nearly everything they had worked and contributed so hard to save. Many participating employers would be forced to close or cut jobs. American taxpayers would have suffered as well. One expert estimated that if Congress failed to address the multi-employer pension crisis, the total cost to U.S. taxpayers in terms of lost tax revenue and increased social safety net spending due to pensioners' difficulty making ends meet would be between $170 billion and $240 billion over a 10-year budget window. This far exceeds the estimated $86 billion cost of the solution included in the American Rescue Plan Act. As we proceed, we should remain mindful that taxpayers would have been on the hook one way or another with the multi-employer pension crisis. By acting now, congressional Democrats and the Biden administration averted a catastrophe, spared over 1 million Americans harm, saved businesses, and protected jobs, which in my view was the right thing to do and far better and less expensive for taxpayers than doing nothing. Certainly, we can all agree that a look back on lessons learned is valuable. But today's hearing is not about past action. It's about the present state of private sector retirement and what we need to do in the future to make it stronger and more inclusive. I'm certain we all believe that Americans, after a hard working life, deserve to retire in some level of security. That's what this hearing is about. For decades, the retirement system has been premised on Americans relying on the 3 income streams, the so-called 3-legged stool, to support themselves as they age: Social Security, employer-sponsored pensions, and personal savings. Social Security remains the foundation of retirement security for most Americans. When President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act into law, he talked about giving it, quote, some measure of protection to the average citizen and to their family against poverty-ridden old age, end quote. He was right. To this day, Social Security provides the majority of income to most elderly Americans and single-handedly keeps 15 million Americans out of poverty. There's been a changing social model over the past decades. In 1975, 47% of women with children were in the labor force. Most of those were part-time jobs. Now it is 72%, most of them full-time jobs. Many Americans aged 65 and older left the labor force in 2020 due to the pandemic, but millions remain. And according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, people held on average 12 jobs from age 18 to 52, with nearly half of these jobs held before age 25. 12 jobs from age 18 to 52, and half of those before they're 25. Meanwhile, the employer-provided retirement and wage earning landscapes also significantly changed. These changes have been to the detriment of the worker's ability in our society to achieve a secure and dignified retirement for Americans. Employers have shifted away from offering traditional defined benefit pension plans, which provided workers guaranteed lifetime income after they retired. Nowadays, when a private sector employer offers a retirement plan, it is likely to be a defined contribution plan, such as a 401k. But that's if employers offer one at all. To many, a retirement savings plan through their employer, an estimated 7.5 million Californians and roughly 55 million people nationwide do not have access to retirement benefits through their employer. There are also significant disparities along racial and ethnic lines when it comes to retirement savings. According to the Urban Institute, in 2016, white families had about $130,000 more, or 6 times more, in average liquid retirement savings than African Americans and Hispanic families. That disparity has increased 5-fold over the past 25 years. Additionally, few Americans are earning enough to save for stable, secure retirement. Workers are doing more today than ever before. Over the last 40 years, worker productivity has risen 72.2%. At the same time, worker wages has essentially stagnated, increasing only 17%. Worker productivity in the last 40 years has increased over 70%, wages adjusted for inflation increasing less than 20%. It is incredibly hard for workers to do much on their own for retirement. When according to the Federal Reserve, many would struggle to come up with the money to finance an unexpected $400 expense, such as a car repair or medical bill in their daily life. That is why I believe retirement security is fundamentally aligned with workers' wages during their lifetime. The more people earn, the easier it is for them to plan to save retirement. At a minimum, we must support policies that increase worker wages and strengthen their ability to organize collective bargaining. The data is clear that unionized workers have greater access to retirement plans and higher participation rates than their non-unionized counterparts. But we shouldn't stop there. We must strengthen and protect Social Security. We must address inequities and discriminatory barriers in the labor market. I also am interested in learning more from the witnesses of today about the Secure Act 2.0 and how it helps Americans plan and save for retirement. Before I conclude, I just wanted to recall a recent issue of the New York Times Magazine discussing how human lifespan doubled over the past century. And now, with medicines combating diseases and prolonging life, the number of people who might live to be 100 years old should increase. According to the United Nations estimates cited by the New York Times, there were 95,000 centurions in the world 1990, centenarians, but there could be 25 million by 2100. A recent Kaiser Foundation report showed that people over 65's life expectancy is increasing exponentially. According to this study, the US ranks 13th in the world in life expectancy increases for people over 65. I'm proud to say when you separate that by region, the Western United States and state of California, where I live, is number one in the world in life expectancy for people over 65. We must make sure our retirement system is equipped to support people living longer, and then it provides the measure of protection Franklin Roosevelt mentioned in 1935. I look forward to hearing from my colleagues, from our expert witnesses about these issues, and I now am pleased to recognize my friend and distinguished ranking member from Georgia, Mr. Allen, for his opening statement. Mr. Allen.
All right, we're unmuted. Thank you, Chairman. We all desire financial security in our latter years. Individuals work for decades and diligently save money to have peace of mind when they move from success, their career, to significance. And for decades, this committee in Congress has come together in a bipartisan fashion to address the financial needs of our nation's workers and retirees. The Pension Protection Act of 2006 strengthened protections for workers owed pension benefits, and the Multi-Employer Pension Reform Act of 2014 established a responsible and balanced process to save multi-employer pension plans projected to run out of money. The bipartisan approach continued last Congress. Republicans and Democrats worked together to pass the Secure Act of 2019, which empowered small businesses to offer retirement plans through open, multiple, and pooled employer plans. The Bipartisan CARES Act allowed workers to tap into their retirement savings without penalty to offset pandemic-induced hardships. However, earlier this year, Democrats went in a different direction and used pandemic relief as an excuse to bail out failing multi-employer pensions without any structural reforms to hold unions and businesses accountable for the mismanagement of their pension plans. Taxpayers are now on the hook for this $86 billion bailout. Asking hardworking taxpayers to foot the bill for a contract between private parties is unsustainable and an abuse of the public's trust. Democrats are doing workers and retirees a great disservice by defending outdated defined benefit multi-employer pension plans. Our nation's economy and workplaces have evolved, but these pension plans have not evolved along with them. The simple fact of the matter is that most of these plans can no longer fulfill their promises. 96% of multi-employer plan participants are enrolled in pensions that are less than 60% funded. Instead of modernizing outdated policies, Democrats continue to double down on failed pension arrangements. They depend on taxpayers not to notice that they are now on the hook for decades of mistakes made by entities with a track record of mismanagement. We must empower individuals to make the best financial choices for their own unique situation. Republicans trust the American worker. We believe every worker and retiree knows how best to save and spend their own money. Defined contribution plans present employees a flexible pathway to realize their retirement goals. There are numerous reasons why defined contribution plans like 401k are more advantageous for employees. Defined contribution plans are immediately the property of employees, can be tailored to the precise retirement needs of the worker, and will never require taxpayer bailout. Furthermore, defined contribution plans are portable. Individual accounts travel with the worker as the person finds another job. These flexibilities are crucial in the modern economy. I see room for bipartisanship and common sense policy updates, and this committee must lead the way in working together to expand on the Secure Act and ensure that Americans are secure in their retirement. One way we can help Americans secure a comfortable retirement is by making it easier for them to save part of their paycheck earlier in their working life. As this committee considers updates to ERISA, we must focus on expanding access to defined contribution plans, increasing retirement options for employees of small businesses, making plans more transparent, and eliminating the need for future taxpayer-funded bailouts of special interests. This committee has a long history of working together in a bipartisan way to address the retirement security needs of American workers and retirees. We need to return to that model by adopting evidence-based, balanced, and fiscally responsible solutions moving forward. This approach, accompanied by policies to ensure a growing and vibrant economy, will do far more to help American workers and retirees in the long run. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. I'm encouraged by your comments and look forward to working with you. I think we can all agree that responsible oversight by this committee, this subcommittee, would be a great addition, and really look forward in a bipartisan way to look at that and evidence-based oversight, both for the financial institutions that do much of this investment and the management of those. So encouraging. Without objection, all other members who wish to insert written statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically in Microsoft Word format by 5 p.m. on July 7th. Now I'd like to introduce our witnesses, really great panel. I want to thank our staff for getting them here, both Republican and Democratic staff. First, Dr. Teresa Ghilarducci is a professor of economics at the New School for Social Research and the director of the Schwartz Center for Economic Policy Analysis and the New School's Retirement Equity Lab. Dr. Nari Ree is the director of the Retirement Security Program at the finest public university in the country, a neighbor of mine in my district, the University of California, Berkeley Center for Labor Research and Education, although I'm not biased. Dr. Andrew Biggs is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, and Dr. David Certia is Legislative Counsel and Director for Legislative Policy for the Government Affairs at ARP. I apologize for any mispronunciations. Our instructions to witnesses are as follows. We appreciate the witnesses for participating today and look forward to your testimony. Your written statement will appear in full in the hearing record, and you are asked to limit your oral presentation to 5 minutes. After your presentation, we will move to member questions. The witnesses are aware of their responsibility to provide accurate information to the subcommittee, and therefore we will immediately proceed to their testimony. And I will first recognize Dr. Ghilarducci. Doctor.
Thanks very much. Even though I've taught at 2 universities, at present, the New School for Social Research in New York, and for 25 years at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana, I did attend all my schooling at the best and greatest university, the University of California at Berkeley. Both undergraduate, master's, PhD, so I agree. I'm here to talk about the landscape of what this country has done for older workers. It's called the 100 Years of Progress in Equalizing Retirement and How We Could Lose It. Before Social Security and defined benefit plans were established, workers were more likely to die than they were more likely to retire. They died in their boots. And women's work was mainly unpaid. She did significant paid work when she did do that all throughout her life, and that was mostly in taking in boarders. It was the modern day Airbnb, and she never retired either. In the 15 years or so before Social Security was passed, and that was in 1935, of course, only a few soldiers, some government and railroad workers had a pension. A scattering of union workers had pensions, and most of those were in single and multi-employer plans. And still, 5 years after Social Security was passed, it was only the privileged that were truly able to retire. They would tell historians and researchers at the time, oh, I retired because I wanted to. There was reference in the opening statements about a dignified retirement, being able to look forward to retirement, but that was a very rare event. Only 3% of retirees had a voluntary retirement, and I'll tell that story up into the present. And of course, that 3% were the most privileged. They had the highest income, highest wealth, and they were healthier. Age in this period of time was a person's largest risk factor of being poor. Age in itself was a risk factor of being poor. And your grandparents and your great-grandparents and those before that were at very high risk of living with their relatives when they got older. And if they weren't that lucky to have kin or relatives to live with, in this country, the poor elderly were sent to county poorhouses. Or when those were closed because of the brutality in the early 20th century, the aged went to institutions they called then insane asylums. The older poor were living with people who were severely mentally ill. So one of the first signs of progress that came with elders having more income was that they got to live independently and they weren't poor. But given the work that we're doing now, we've done for the past 10 years since the last recession, we are predicting that the erosion of pensions, the scattered coverage of the defined contribution plans that we talked about in opening statements, and the decline of defined benefit plans, and the fact that they're top heavy, that they really are something that the top people in the upper income distribution have, or is going to create a situation where we're going back to the future. Right now, all of us here at the hearing are at greater risk of our parents moving in with us in our spare bedroom, in our basements, in our renovated garage than our parents faced with our grandparents. And another reverse of progress that I fear is the widening gap between the classes and the widening gap in what we have taken for granted. And that is the ability to retire in some kind of decency. So right now, a working man in the bottom third of the educational distribution, it's the best proxy for socioeconomic class that we have, he can expect to have 12 years of retirement, not 20 or 30, it's about 12 years when we use actual data to see when people actually retire and when they die. And at the upper third, 14 years, so 12 and 14. Now there's a class divide there, but it's not that great. And it's something we should celebrate. The rich and the poor and the middle class have been able to retire. But this is something that can be reversed very soon, because retirement equity came from defined benefit plans, both single and multi-employer, retiree health plans, and an expanding Social Security system. Now, I come before you today as a professor and an historian, a professor of economics, but for 25 years, I've served as a trustee of not only the public pension plans for Indiana when I was at Notre Dame, also a corporate director representing shareholders for the Yellow Freight Company, the biggest contributor, one of the biggest contributors to the Teamsters Central States Fund. So I represented the shareholders there. And now I represent the $60 billion, I'm a trustee of a $60 billion healthcare fund for United Auto Workers and the big three auto companies, and for $1 billion for steel workers and the Goodyear tire, the tire company. And what I learned from these roles is that the incomes that our members have and take to their communities, and they're all over the country. They're not just concentrated in Michigan or in Indiana or in Pennsylvania, they're everywhere. When they take those incomes to their communities, it has a huge multiplier effect. The Social Security, the pensions, and the healthcare really adds to the health of those communities. So it's not just the workers, it's their employers and it's their communities.
Thank you,
No,
Dr.
not everyone had a DB plan before. Only 70% of full-time workers had a DB plan then, and now that's switched. And so the workers lucky enough to have any kind of plan, mostly it's
I'm going to have to
401k.
ask you to wrap up.
Got it. Okay, sorry about that. One concern I have is that if we don't do something, we'll have more elders in poverty. Well, we have a solution. It's something that I provided back in 2018, and something now live that's very bipartisan. I'm working with an unlikely partner, Kevin Hassett, who was on Trump's Council of Economic Advisors. We have proposed with the Economic Innovation Group that everyone have access to a plan like you all have, the Thrift Savings Plan. So we have offering up a platform for everyone to have it. If we don't do that, we could reverse the decades of promise we've had in retirement equity.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
Look forward to hearing more about your partnership. Dr. Rhee, you are up for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for this opportunity to be here today. I want to make 3 points today related to the inequalities in the current private sector retirement system related to race, gender, and income. And I'm so happy that you covered a lot of the basic data. So I'm going to kind of reframe and talk about sort of the interactions between the employer-sponsored retirement system and the fact that it is now primarily a defined contribution system, and dynamics inside and outside the labor market that results in an incredible degree of inequality in retirement savings outcomes. So as you mentioned, the retirement benefit access in the private sector is incomplete. It's far short of 100%. And it also varies wildly by occupation, industry, and wage level, not to mention firm size, so that the likelihood of being offered a retirement plan as a private sector worker is directly correlated with your wage level. At the end of the day, only about 20% of workers in the bottom quartile, bottom 25%, have actually participate in a private sector retirement plan. So this intersects with sort of labor market segmentation, and also kind of women's work realities. One is that if you look at it by industry or occupation, the sectors with the heaviest concentrations of Black and Latino workers also have the lowest rates of retirement benefit sponsorship. I'm just going to pull out 2 sectors, hotel and restaurants. Latinos and Black workers are 60% overrepresented in that sector relative to their overall labor market presence. Only 33% of workers in that sector are offered a plan. Similarly, in administrative and wage services, it's which is also heavily overrepresented in terms of workers of color, only 38% have access. And then if you look at the top levels where workers are underrepresented in terms of workers of color, it's the reverse, right? You'll see 80% or higher rates of access in things like finance and business services. So the upshot of this is that only 46% of Black working households and 37% of Latino working households has anybody in a pension or 401k in that family, compared to 60% of white working households. So I would say that both white working households and households of color are not looking so good, but obviously there's an additional racial disparity. So I'm going to ask the facilitator to advance to figure 3. I just have a few charts that I want to highlight just to illustrate the magnitude of inequality. So if you skip forward to figure 3, please, thank you. So we're looking at retirement account balances among near retirement households by income quintile in 2019. And so just kind of eyeball this chart and you can see that there's a tremendous degree of inequality in account balances. And this is just typical account balances. If you look at mean or average account balances, it looks a lot worse. And then you'll notice the zeros in the bottom 40% of the chart. And that is because less than well under half of households in the bottom 40% of this age group basically they don't own a retirement account. So I'm gonna advance to figure 5, which shows the same kind of data by race. And this is for working age households aged 25 to 64. And so again, you'll see that the median balance for all Black and Latino households is 0, because in fact, 60% of Black households and 68% of Latino households do not own a retirement account. And among the lucky few that do, the typical balance is less than half that of a typical balance of white households. And again, it looks much worse if you look at means as opposed to medians. Finally, on figure 7, just to break things out quickly by sex and marital status. So marriage definitely gives you a boost in retirement security, although the balances aren't that impressive. And single women-led households tend to be the worst off. So women face particular challenges in the employer-based retirement system. The data indicates that women have approximate parity with men in terms of retirement benefit access, but they also face a lot of challenges, and that is longer lives, the gender pay gap, and just in general lower wages than men, but also their lifetime earnings are really truncated by unpaid caregiving work. And that includes a cumulative cost of hundreds of thousands of dollars for women who have to take time out of the labor force. I see that we're over time, so I just want to highlight a couple of things. I've been deeply involved in the formation of the CalSavers Auto IRA program. And the states are just desperate for a solution to this problem because this is going to hit them in their pocketbooks and they know it. So some states have just jumped in and gotten tired of the federal government to act on universal retirement coverage. And at the same time, they're severely limited in terms of what they can do by ERISA preemption, right? So they can't take employer contributions. They can't cover the part-time workers who are excluded from ERISA regulated plans. And so I think there's need for federal leadership on this issue. And the last point I want to make is that wage policy is incredibly important. California enacted the $15 minimum wage the same day that it enacted CalSavers, and combined, it has the potential to increase low-wage workers' retirement incomes by up to 50% above the status quo. So wage policy is incredibly important. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. We'll now go to Dr. Biggs for 5 minutes. Doctor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Allen, for the opportunity to testify today. A study published by a prominent think tank predicted that, quote, more than 40% of households between the ages of 47 and 64 will not be able to replace even half of their pre-retirement incomes once they stop working. Nearly 20% will have retirement incomes below the poverty line. Those claims could have jumped from the testimony at today's hearing, where you've heard the retirement system is eroding and retiree poverty will skyrocket. And yet that frightening study was published nearly 2 decades ago by the Progressive Economic Policy Institute, and none of its dire predictions came to pass. Poverty in old age didn't increase. In fact, it fell substantially. Retirement incomes did not decline, but instead rose to record levels. And instead of a retirement crisis, 80% of retirees today tell Gallup surveys they have enough money not merely to survive, but to, quote, live comfortably. Only 5% of seniors tell a Federal Reserve survey they are, quote, finding it hard to get by. The data show clearly that never before have so many Americans saved so much for retirement. Never before have retiree incomes been so high or poverty in old age so low. And so I predict the same will hold for the dire warnings you will hear today. But even more importantly, the federal government itself does not predict anything approaching a retirement crisis. The Social Security Administration's most sophisticated retirement income model projects that future retirees will have a median retirement income replacement rate of about 110% of their career average earnings. That's very similar to today's retirees. The share with low replacement rates also will remain the same, while poverty in old age will continue to fall. Why is the future so much brighter than some would have you believe? Because we've done the things necessary to boost retirement savings. The switch from traditional pensions to 401ks means that more Americans have access to retirement plans. Back in the mid-1970s, when traditional pension participation was at its peak, only around 4 in 10 private sector workers had a retirement plan. IRS data show that nearly 60% of workers are participating in a plan today. Among married couples, over 80% have at least one spouse participating in a retirement plan, and it's likely that over 90% of couples have at least one spouse who's offered a plan. We've come a long way. 401ks also boosted savings because, unlike traditional pensions, both employer and employee pay in. Since the 1970s, total retirement plan contributions rose from 5.8% of employee wages and salaries to 8.4%. That's a 45% relative increase in retirement savings. Total retirement plan assets today are 7 times higher than back in the 1970s. Federal Reserve data show that retirement savings have increased in every age, income, educational, and racial or ethnic group. 401ks are also much more portable than traditional pensions, which helps workers who switch jobs or take time out of the workforce. All in all, while just 45% of retirees received benefits from a private retirement plan in 1990, 61% of retirees do today. When we think about a retirement system, especially how different groups are treated, we need to think about the whole system. US households today hold $41 trillion in private retirement savings. Those savings are skewed towards high earners. But Americans have also earned nearly $41 trillion in Social Security benefits. And Social Security benefits are tilted towards low-income households. For instance, the CBO finds that the poorest fifth of retirees receive Social Security benefits equal to about 80% of their pre-retirement earnings, while the richest fifth receive a replacement rate of just 34% of their earnings. Given this, it's not at all surprising the low-income Americans save little on top of Social Security, while high-income Americans save a great deal more. Remember, retirement saving isn't about ending life with the most money. It's about saving enough to maintain your standard of living once you stop working. And a variety of data show the vast majority of Americans, rich and poor and from different walks of life, are able to do that. I support policies to give all Americans access to retirement plans. The US retirement system has made great progress in the last several decades, and it's foolish to deny that progress. But past progress isn't enough. We need to keep working to fill the gaps that remain in our system so that every American who wants and needs to save for retirement has an easy and affordable way to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor. We'll now go to our last witness, panelist, Dr. Sertner. I apologize for the previous mispronunciation. Dr. Sertner, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on improving our retirement system. A secure retirement traditionally centered on the three-legged stool of employer-provided pensions, personal savings, and Social Security. Unfortunately, diminishing pensions and inadequate savings, plus longer life expectancies and higher health costs, has put a secure retirement out of reach for too many, requiring Social Security to play an even greater role in retirement. Social Security is already the principal source of income for over half of older households. Roughly 1/4, about 10 million people, depend on Social Security for nearly all, meaning 90% or more of their income. Social Security keeps approximately 15 million older Americans out of poverty and allows millions more to live without fear of outliving their income. And while Social Security is the base of income in retirement, more is needed. The dramatic switch from defined benefit plans to defined contribution plans over the past 40 years has important implications for retirement security. Employees are now responsible for whether and how much to save and must manage their retirement funds, even though most have little investment experience. And unfortunately, most workers are not saving enough. Of course, access to a plan is better than none at all. Remarkably, less than half of all workers have access to a retirement plan at work. Now, Congress has taken numerous steps to make retirement saving easier, including features such as automatic enrollment and default investments that have helped workers and increased savings. However, automatic features only help workers who have a retirement plan. Expanding coverage to the tens of millions of workers without coverage remains a high priority. At the state level, AARP is focused on passing what are called work and save programs, like CalSavers, which provide employer-facilitated access to payroll deduction savings options for workers who don't have a way to save for retirement at work. Such access helps address the coverage gap because workers are 15 times more likely to save for retirement simply through payroll deduction at work. State programs have already shown much promise in increasing coverage and savings. In addition to state programs, federal policy should also encourage automatic payroll deduction savings. AARP has been a longtime supporter of federal auto IRA legislation, most recently proposed by House Ways and Means Chairman Neal. AARP also supports bipartisan legislation recently approved by the Ways and Means Committee, the Securing a Strong Retirement Act, known as Secure 2, which includes many important changes. The bill would improve coverage for the 27 million part-time workers who generally are not covered by retirement savings plans. This is especially important for older workers and caregivers who often shift to part-time work. The bill would also automatically enroll workers in new employer retirement savings plans. Secure 2 includes an important requirement for an annual paper retirement benefit statement, which AARP strongly supports. Plan participants who generally prefer paper copies of important financial documents should be provided statements in paper form unless they choose electronic delivery. Congress needs to ensure that workers receive and can review their annual benefit statement, similar to the Social Security and federal employee statement of benefits, to help employees better understand and manage their plans. Secure 2 would also establish a National Retirement Lost and Found office to help workers locate retirement accounts with previous employers. This has become increasingly important as more workers change jobs several times over their career. And Secure 2 also makes improvements to the required minimum distribution rules, including exempting a threshold amount that will both simplify the rules and help preserve savings. Separately, AARP also supports efforts to improve the Savers Tax Credit, which acts as a matching contribution for low and moderate income taxpayers who contribute to a retirement plan. Improvements to the credit, again, can encourage and increase savings for those who are least able to save. We also must do more to protect hard-earned retirement nest eggs. All tax-preferred retirement savings should be prudently invested with reasonable fees and without conflicts of interest. A uniform, strong fiduciary standard should ensure that all financial professionals act in the sole interest of their customers when providing investment advice. AARP also urges Congress to discourage pre-retirement cash outs of retirement funds and instead encourage account portability and stable lifetime income streams. We look forward to working with the committee to encourage asset preservation and to provide low-cost distribution and spend-down options that meet workers' needs in retirement. Finally, AARP commends the Congress for enacting earlier this year important legislation to protect the earned benefits of millions of workers and retirees counting on multi-employer pensions for retirement security. Many retirees experienced or were facing devastating benefit cuts. While this was a difficult problem, the legislative support was critical to protecting the benefits of workers and retirees who had worked hard, earned their benefits, and were put at risk through no fault of their own. Again, in conclusion, AARP would again like to thank the committee for considering the challenges and needs for a secure retirement and the opportunity to share our policy views. We stand ready to work with the committee to improve Americans' retirement security. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you to all the panelists. Terrific testimony. I appreciate the content and the tone very much. Under committee rule, we will now question the witnesses under the 5-minute rule, please. And I will be recognizing subcommittee members in seniority order. As the list I currently have from staff, I'm going to speak first, then we'll go to Representative Wahlberg and then Representative Norcross. As chair, I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. And again, I want to thank the panelists, and I look forward to further discussion in the terminology of the ranking member evidence-based research. We certainly can have differences of opinion to our approach, and we do, to solving this problem, but I respect divergent opinions. And if we go by the evidence-based research, I think we can really make a strong progress. And I want to work with other committees of jurisdiction, particularly Ways and Means, but this committee, subcommittee, and I know the full committee, thinks this is a priority. And I appreciate all the input from subcommittee members prior to this hearing. And I'm open to further input. And Dr. Biggs, I appreciate your testimony. We certainly want to be driven by the evidence-based research, but I also don't think it necessarily contradicts the testimony for Dr. Rhee. And it's reflective of our overall inequality in this country, which isn't surprising, both for workers and for retirees. So the question is, how best do we have a discussion about that? There's nothing wrong with capital investments in general, if they're done with responsibility towards all, as Picardie's work and Emmanuel Saez's work would indicate to me. But that balance between wages and capital investment, both for workers and retirees, are important for everybody's happiness. So I look forward to talking to you personally, Dr. Biggs, and other panelists on how we can honestly address these issues in a thoughtful way in this subcommittee. And as the ranking member says, be driven by evidence-based research. My questions, Dr. Ghilarducci, in my opening statement, I mentioned the recent New York Times magazine on the doubling of life expectancy between 1920 and 2020. So the social model has changed, mostly for better, I would say, and particularly having two incomes in the workforce. Certainly household productivity, I think, is undeniably increased in the United States because of this addition, but it's caused strains on our system as well. And the social model is very different. Young people are forced to have greater mobility when they look for jobs, not just in their own neighborhood and community and region, but nationally. So in your written statement, you mentioned several reasons why older Americans are better off these past 100 years. Would you please talk briefly about how having the ability to retire with a pension is so important and connected to human longevity and the quality of life as we get older? Doctor?
Yeah, yes, just quickly, and I'm sorry I went over time last time. We tend to think that improving longevity just happens. And that requires people to work longer because people improve their longevity and they're also exited the labor market, as if those two things were unrelated. And what the research, the medical research using the Health and Retirement Survey and other sources of data have shown is that living longer is actually related to being able to retire voluntarily with income. For many, many people, and it's unequally distributed this way, working at old age causes a lot of stress. Cortisol levels go up, you are subordinate in the workforce, you can't control the pace and content of your time like many of us can do now. And so, especially for women in service organizations or paid care work, working every day in your 60s and 70s actually reduces longevity. So, Andrew, notwithstanding your warning that our predictions can be wrong, the evidence is pointing to if we're forcing people to work longer because we don't do anything about our pension system, we could actually reverse that great longevity gain and make those longevity gains really unequal. Most of those longevity gains, as you know, have gone to people in the top of the income distribution.
Dr. Reed, let's talk about comparisons globally. We talk a lot about global competitiveness. Dr. Reed or Dr. Garalucci, how do we compare vis-a-vis our global competitors? Dr. Reed.
I think in terms of retirement plan coverage, I want to sort of stress that it's a totality, right, between Social Security, pensions, employer-sponsored pensions, and private savings. And we just want to make sure that there's universal coverage and that benefits are adequate. And I think that on the whole, U.S. Social Security benefits are less generous than other advanced countries, and we need to be doing more on the pension front. And that's actually not what's going on.
Thank you, Doctor. My time is up. I am told that the ranking member would like to wait until later in the testimony for questioning. So that would put my friend and colleague from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg, as the next speaker. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the panel for being here today. An important issue. Retirement security is an important topic and one that has a history of bipartisan support. Americans dream of retiring with financial security, but unfortunately, many struggle on how to get there. With that in mind, in 2018, when I chaired this committee, we held a bipartisan hearing that examined solutions to modernize our retirement system and make it easier for employees to save for retirement. The proposals that we discussed in 2018 were later signed into law, gratefully, as part of the SECURE Act, which was the first major update to our retirement policies in over a decade. Ensuring that American retirees can count on sufficient income to last throughout their retirement is not only important to families, but also for our economy. So I thank the committee for holding this hearing, and I hope that members on this committee will continue our history of bipartisanship and build upon the success of the SECURE Act so every American can retire with dignity and peace of mind. Dr. Biggs, thank you for being here as an additional point of view that we truly need to hear. Employer-sponsored retirement plans are an indispensable pillar to the U.S. retirement system. That's not really debatable. Could you please elaborate on your research regarding participation in employer-sponsored plans and the amount of savings employees are achieving through this model?
Well, thank you very much, Congressman Wahlberg. I think we all agree that having an employer or having a retirement plan at work increases savings significantly versus having to set one up on your own, such as through an IRA. So it's important that employers offer these plans. What we have seen over time is that employers are increasingly offering retirement plans. Some gaps remain. But if we go back to the heyday of traditional pensions, which we all have rose-colored glasses on, I think at their peak, 39% of private sector workers participated in a defined benefit plan. Today, you have somewhere around 60% of workers participating in some sort of plan, more than that being offered a plan. So when we think about why employers will offer a plan, we have to think of the attributes of the plan. A defined benefit pension, a traditional benefit, is very onerous on the employer to offer, both from an administrative standpoint, but also from the standpoint of financial liabilities. What happened up to the mid-70s, before we had ERISA, was that employers were willing to offer traditional pensions, but they didn't fund them, and they set these vesting requirements such that literally like 92% of defined benefit participants, according to a Senate Labor Committee study in the 1970s, they participated in the plan, they never collected benefits because they didn't vest. ERISA changed that and said, well, if you're going to offer benefits, you have to have reasonable vesting requirements and you have to fund them. That's when employers said it's not really worth it to us to offer these plans anymore. 401k plans are much easier for employers to offer, and so coverage spread. We have in relative terms 50% more employees participating in 401k plans today than we did with traditional pensions. So you have to think about what is on the employer side and how to facilitate them offering that plan, because that's really a crucial aspect.
Dr. Biggs, could you describe the existing barriers that may discourage certain employers, especially small employers, from offering a retirement plan to their employees?
Yeah, small employers are really where the gaps exist. If you look at larger employers, vast majority of them are already offering a plan. For small employers, you have a couple of issues. All along, we've had issues with sort of the fixed costs of offering a retirement plan. If you're running a laundromat or something like that, and you have 10 employees, you still have to get a financial advisor. You may have some legal fees involved with setting it up. So it's a bigger issue, bigger cost for you compared to the number of employees you're to serve. The second issue, which is more recent, is potential liability issues. The lawsuits against 401k plan providers have increased significantly in recent years. So if you're a small employer, you may today just say it's not worth the trouble to me, that there's a cost burden involved, and then I may be taking on a financial risk. And so we need to address those things, both smooth the costs out for them, but also make very clear what you can do to be protected. And I think if you do that, they'll be more willing. But we also need to be realistic. I don't think you're going to get 100% coverage among small employers. So then we want to think about what other options might be for workers in those employers.
So much more I could ask, but my time has ended, so I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Wahlberg. Really good questions. As a former small business owner and restaurateur who struggled with this issue, another area that I think that we could have a really good discussion about on what's best for those small businesses who are already struggling to make ends meet. Next is the distinguished gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Norcross, somebody who has a unique passion on this issue.
Well, first of all, thank you, Chairman, for holding this meeting and bringing to the front of the line something that is near and dear to everyone on this call, whether you agree how we get there or not. It's those golden years. And certainly we work all our lives and we want to be able to enjoy that as we get there. And certainly to my colleagues on the other side, Mr. Wahlberg and I have reached many common grounds on this. So I think there's a real pathway here. When we looked over the past year, it's been a challenge to every one of us. Luckily, we finally came together, and this is after we served on the bicameral bipartisan commission a couple of years ago, focusing on how we would save the multi-employer. Somehow we talk about it like it's companies or unions. These are people. These are people that were saved. And why we might have a disagreement on how we saved it, the fact of the matter is, literally thousands of men and women are going to be able to survive in their retirement. And that's thanks to that plan. And by the way, this wasn't just one side. It was UPS, Kroger, large companies that literally could have gone bankrupt if it had not been for this. The Chamber of Commerce, National Association Manufacturers. So what I want to start out with is, quite frankly, what would have happened if we didn't pass this and we went down the road? So, Ms. Gagliarducci, could you touch base? What would have been the cost, social and otherwise, financial, to this country had we not saved the multi-employer plan?
They would have been substantial. As I mentioned in my testimony, the dollars spent by the retiree in those communities multiplied and created aggregate demand. It also allowed the member to stay in their communities. As I said, I was the trustee for a director for the shareholders of Yellow Freight, based in Kansas City, and that company would have gone bankrupt if it had to fund the multi-employer plan all in itself, as they were supporting many more retirees than they had members. So it could have caused bankruptcy of major employers and a loss of income and vitality in those Midwestern and other working class communities. It would have been far more than the $80 billion, probably another 2 or 3.
Thank you. And listen, we as a country make these decisions, and obviously in Congress we do. The trillions of dollars we just spent propping up businesses through the pandemic, you could call that a bailout. No, it's helping Americans, and thank you for your discussion on this issue. Mr. Sertner, I want to talk about Secure Act 2.0. Unfortunately or fortunately, history and human behavior has taught us that once an employee gets the money in the paycheck, it is so much more difficult for them to turn around and contribute to a retirement plan. Why? Particularly in the lower economic scale of wages. Hey, do I want to send my kid to camp? Do I want to buy them a pair of sneakers? Extremely difficult. Those plans across the spectrum that have been successful, it's pre-dollars in the paycheck. The Secure 2.0 talks about the automatic enrollment. Can you go into a little bit more detail on the 401 and 403? Why is that important that we get the auto enrollment ahead of the curve when it comes to the outcome?
Okay. Thank you, Congressman. Automatic enrollment dramatically increases enrollment of the workforce. So it usually jumps from anywhere close from around 50% to around 80% when you have automatic enrollment. Again, so if the employee is not paying attention, if they're joining a firm, they're automatically basically making the right decision for the employee. They're going to be put in the plan, they can start saving. Now it's up, the employee always has a choice to opt out, but most employees when they join up are not thinking about retirement. And it's good to have the system automatically putting them in the right direction. If they want to make other choices, that's great, but it's better that we have an automatic system that's getting people A, to sign up, and B, are getting into funds normally like default lifestyle funds that basically can put them in a more diversified investment scenario that's more appropriate for their age. So this is putting people on the track to a better retirement.
And it's a bipartisan approach, and we certainly appreciate what they're doing because, again, defined benefit, we all participate in it. Defined contribution, so many employers only contribute if the employee contributes, and those on the lower economic scale, unfortunately, need to eat and take care of life. Unfortunately, I've run out of time, but thank you for the testimony. I yield back to the chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Norcross. And again, thank you for your passion on this issue. And I do, since I bragged on the University of California, I want to brag for you about Rutgers University and their Labor Institute in your district. Next, Mr. Banks, if you're prepared, you are next in the queue. If not, we will go to Representative Hershberger, pardon me.
Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member, and all the witnesses today. You know, I'm a small business owner too that offered a 401k to my employees because that helps me retain employees, absolutely. And it's a good investment in their future as well as future of the business. Mr. Biggs, Dr. Biggs, I'm looking over your testimony and, I'm looking at the increase in, people joining 401ks and employer ratings. 81% since 2017, 81% of joint tax return filers have at least one member of the couple participating in a retirement plan. And then we see the Department of Labor statistics that show, a 45% increase in total private sector pension contributions in the last 40 years. And what's remarkable is since 1989, retirement savings have increased in every age, income, educational, racial, ethnic group. To me, that's pretty remarkable that it encompasses every race, every age, every income, every educational, and every ethnic group. So to me, there's not a discrepancy or disparity there, but I do have a couple of questions. And one of the things that occurs to me is we need to make some value-based judgments about the respective roles of Social Security, employment-based pensions, and individual savings. And I have a couple of questions about that. Number one is, do we want to follow the historical traditional three-leg stool approach to retirement security, or just disregard it in favor of another approach? And the second part of that question is there still a role for all three of these elements? And the third part is, do we even want there to be a role for all three of these elements? And if so, then we need to decide how much of the job should be done by each component. So if you could offer me some perspectives on those three components, I'd be very interested in hearing about it.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. One thing, if you look at the sort of research literature on retirement, which is pretty wonky, but often we'll say a retiree wants to have an income equal to 70% of their pre-retirement rate, a 70% replacement rate. When you actually look at their research, things differ quite a bit between different households of how much income they need in retirement. That can depend on your earnings level, depend on what children you have, family size, etc. So you want to leave flexibility. You don't want to set up your mandatory saving system like Social Security so that it covers everything that somebody might need, because we know that's going to differ from person to person. We also don't want to cover too much of retirement income via Social Security, because that is, to be frank, it's a funding system that is not good for economic growth. It may be a great system to have, but savings-based systems would be stronger for economic growth. So we want to leave discretion between people's personal choices and what they're getting from Social Security. So I think we want to build on what we have. We don't want to eliminate that.
Okay, very, very good. This is it's critical that we make the changes, just like, improving what we already have, the Secure 2.0. Dr. Biggs, do you believe that corporate sponsors of pension plans who underestimate their plan liabilities and who underfund their pension plans should be bailed out with taxpayer money?
Look, when we think about the multi-employer plan problem, we have to remember, we created this in the sense that the government set much lower funding standards for multi-employer plans than they do for single employer plans. So they went into their problems with much lower levels of contributions. They took much longer to address their problems. So this was a predictable crisis. And in fact, you can find things going back 20 years ago predicting this crisis would take place. So the key thing I think to remember here is, A, we created this through bad governance, but B, all of the arguments that are being made today for bailing out the multi-employer plans at $86 billion or whatever it may end up being, those same arguments apply to bailing out underfunded state and local government pensions, where unfunded liabilities aren't 86 billion, it's somewhere north of $4 trillion. If we are going to bail out underfunded pensions for truckers and miners, are we not going to bail out Illinois' policemen and teachers? The rationale we are hearing today is exactly the same. And I think it is a very risky proposition to get into saying we've just got to bail these things out. At some point, the plan is either self-funding and responsible for itself, or it's not. And if we're going to socialize these, we need to regulate them much more carefully than we did. So we really need to think very hard about this stuff.
Thank you, Dr. Biggs, and Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative. Next up is Representative Morelli. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I first and most importantly, thank you for a really important conversation. I'll admit that, you know, for me, thinking about the years ahead and thinking about the changes in pensions in the United States over the years, I am concerned. I talk to my adult children all the time about their retirement savings to make sure that they're thinking about this. I also tell them that you're going to go from 30 years old to 60 years old in about 5 minutes. And if you don't think about it long in advance and really start preparing, you're going to find yourself older quicker than you thought that you would be. But so I'm really grateful to you for the hearing. I think it's really important. I appreciate the witnesses very much for their contributions. One of the things that I worry about in our country is sort of the lack of financial literacy. Right now, I'm going through. Sadly, my mother-in-law passed away a couple of months ago, and my father-in-law was smart to think ahead and is thinking ahead, but he's a little bewildered by all the things that he'll have to make decisions about, and some of it is pretty confusing. And more I talk to people, I realize this is one of those sort of things that that we perhaps haven't done well enough in the country. And I thought perhaps Dr. Sertner, you might be able to comment on any thoughts that you have around increasing literacy for young people as well as people in the workforce about their future, any things that we should be doing or thoughts that you have on it.
Yeah, first, I we agree 100% that literacy has been a huge problem in this area, and it's been compounded by the fact that now with 401k plans and individual retirement accounts, people are asked to take on a lot more of the responsibility. They need to figure out how much I can save. They need to figure out how to invest that money. And then even later on, we're seeing with our own members, when they finally get to retirement, they have some very big decisions to make at retirement about whether it's to take lump sums or annuities, or what distribution option will there be that will help me not outlive my money. And these are very complicated decisions for people to make, and they don't have nearly enough either investment experience or financial planning experience to do that. It's not an easy answer here. We think some of the education should start early. These are great classes, I think, for high school and college kids to have a basic understanding of particularly being able to start saving early. I think Benjamin Franklin did us a disservice when he said a penny saved is a penny earned. He should have said a penny saved is a penny compounded. I think that would have gone a long way of getting money in early into these plans when people aren't thinking about retirement is really one of the best ways to get a good head start. So having education, having notices and information going from the plan and from the providers to the individuals are critically important, because that's very often who the workers are going to listen to, is their employers. And that's one of the reasons we think it's so important that some of this information be provided by paper and not electronically, so people can see what's happening with their plan. They can see what their investments are. They can see what kind of fees that they're paying. They can see what kind of investment returns they're getting. If you don't have that in your hands and can take the time and look it over, you're never going to learn or understand what's going on with your plan. And one of the side problems with having some of these things just done all automatically is that people are paying less and less attention to them. Now, that may not be a bad thing if they're headed in the right direction, but we also do want people to pay attention so that they know what's going on with their own retirements.
Yeah, I will observe, and I had the privilege of chairing the New York State Assembly Committee on Insurance in my service in the state legislature, and the kinds of retirement vehicles that you can now invest in, to your point, taking lump sum distributions or annuities. Are they pre-tax? Are they yet to be taxed? How does that impact? Those are all confusing. And I often think back that I passed my physics regents exam in no small amount to Mr. Euler and his patients. But I think back, I haven't really used my high school physics since I left high school. I might have been better served to have taken a course in financial literacy. And maybe that's what we ought to be encouraging school districts around the country to start doing, but certainly in the workforce. And you're right, when you go to work, you start thinking about, so other ways that our witnesses can provide to us after this on ways that we can increase financial literacy, I think would be really important. With that, Mr. Chairman, again, thanks for the great hearing, and I yield back, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Morelli. Next up is Representative Miller. You are recognized for your 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you to our witnesses for coming to discuss the important issue of retirement security. Dr. Biggs, I found your testimony especially thought-provoking, and I do have a few questions to ask. Okay, so I'm from Illinois, and we are a sinking ship there because, well, according to Moody's, as of June 2020, Illinois' pension liability was at $154 billion. This is unconscionable. The pension liability has been growing steadily since 2006. Illinois state pensions have been critically underfunded or possibly overpromised for more than a decade with no end in sight. It is the elephant in the room. This fund is supposed to provide benefits to public servants in their retirement, but its chronic underfunding threatens to fail these workers. Dr. Biggs, how do states like Illinois get out of this mess? How can we best protect workers and taxpayers from being harmed by these critically underfunded and abused state pensions? Do you have any policy suggestions for my state?
Well, thank you very much, Congresswoman. I'm a member, I've worked a great deal on state and local pension issues. I'm also a member of the Financial Oversight Board that is handling the bankruptcy in Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico's bankruptcy was caused in no small part because it just ran its pension systems into the ground. They just ran out of money. And at that point, everything falls apart. For Illinois, it will be even more difficult if the pension plan runs out of money because the pension liabilities are so large that even if Illinois defaulted on all its debt to bondholders, it still wouldn't have enough money to fill them. I suspect Chicago will probably go bankrupt, 5 years, 10 years from now. Illinois maybe a little bit further, but they need to find ways to get on top of these problems. Illinois is very constrained by constitutional protections, which have been interpreted in such a way you simply can't change benefits. It's also been hamstrung, to be honest, by decades of poor financial management by the government, by the trustees of this plan. And this gets to the issue I raised with multi-employer plans. I mean, Illinois is a known bad actor when it comes to pensions. Mm-hmm. It increased benefits, it promised too much, and it simply refused to do what it needed to do. It won't, even today, will not change its state constitution to allow these adjustments. They have already talked of getting a federal bailout. When that day comes, everybody today in Congress is going to say, we won't bail out these state and local pension plans. But 2 years ago, everybody in Congress is saying we're not going to bail out the multi-employer plans. And that's precisely what we did. Mm-hmm. So when that day comes, there's going to be huge pressure on the federal government to bail these plans out. And the question is, should the taxpayers in states that have been responsible with their pensions, that have funded them fully, that have made reforms when necessary, should they be on the hook for Illinois? And this is one, if I had to propose one solution, if we go back to when ERISA was started in the 1970s, there was some discussion then of subjecting state and local pensions to ERISA coverage, to ERISA regulation. That, in retrospect, would have been entirely appropriate. We thought back then that the state and local governments could be trusted to responsibly fund these plans while corporations couldn't. Turns out none of them could be trusted. They have the same incentives. So I think federal regulation of these plans with some transition period, maybe some incentive to get up to good funding, because these plans pose a systemic financial threat that goes well beyond the government that sponsors them or the borders of their state. So this is a congressional problem. And I really wish Congress would get on top of it before it becomes a congressional crisis where we are forced to do a bailout.
Yes, and I'm so concerned for the rank and file teacher, policemen in our state that have planned their retirement based on maybe a reasonable pension. There's just egregious abuse in the pension system. I know people that are belling up to 3 and 4 pensions. And in the private sector, this would never happen where you could double dip like that. Of course, the 3% COLA and then They don't pay income tax on it, which is all fine, but it's overpromised and we can't afford it. So some lawmakers in my state have been calling for the federal bailout of our state pension. Do you think it's wise for the federal government to bail out failing state pension plans? And if not, are there other policies in the federal government that the federal government should put in place to protect workers and taxpayers, which I know you said if we would have used, but is there anything else that you could think of?
Well, I think Congress needs to act today. You know, everybody will say we're not going to bail out Illinois' pensions. If Illinois' pensions go under, Illinois goes bankrupt. I can tell you from experience in Puerto Rico that a state level bankruptcy is incredibly difficult economically and politically. It is a real problem. At that point, be it Congress or the Federal Reserve, somebody's going to bail out Illinois. So if we can foresee that, the thing we need to do is act today, just as we should have acted 20 years ago with multi-employer pensions, but we didn't. And so the question is, are we going to show leadership, or are we just going to be followership? Are we going to kick the can down the road like we've done with Social Security or multi-employer pensions or whatever? Or are we going to show some leadership on this? State and local pensions, there is no constitutional reason they cannot be federally regulated. The federal government regulates work conditions. They regulate the minimum wage for state and local governments. We can do this stuff. It's all legal. And there's no reason not to do it, because the states, at least the worst ones, have shown they are not capable of running these things responsibly. Whether we're looking at Illinois or New Jersey or Connecticut or Kentucky, these are real problems that are existential threats to the finances of their state and therefore to the economies of their state and even to bordering states. So I think the Congress should really look into this and think about whether ERISA should apply to these plans.
So now,
Representative Miller, your time's up. If you want to wrap up, go ahead.
well, now we can see that we needed federal government regulation, and perhaps we can get that rolling, like you said, today, to act today. But what are we going to do about the problem that we're bankrupt and we can't pay these?
Ultimately, you may default to your bondholders. Beyond that, it's really a tough decision. You know, every public policy analyst says, I have some magic solution for you. No, my magic solution is a time machine to go back 25 years and fix it then. Once you are where Illinois is today, it's really hard to get out of it.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Representative. I'm now going to recognize the gentleman from Michigan, and I'm going to ask him to step in to chair the hearing for a short while I go off to another hearing. Andy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I will ask my questions and then recognize others in order. It's so good to see everybody, and I really appreciate all of our witnesses here for participating in this vital hearing. You know, retirement security should be a right of every American. And I'm proud that the Democratic majority passed much needed relief for multi-employer pension plans as part of the American Rescue Plan. It was the right thing to do to prevent a crisis and protect retirees who are on track to see their pensions reduced, even in some cases to zero, in the midst of a huge economic crisis. Unfortunately, my Republican colleagues have spent a lot of time criticizing and mischaracterizing the Special Financial Assistance Program for multi-employer plans that congressional Democrats included in the American Rescue Plan. For all the reasons Chairman DeSaulnier mentioned in his opening statement, they're wrong. But I think it's also worth discussing how consistently wrong they've been over the decades when it comes to retirement security. In 1935, House and Senate Republicans attempted to eliminate the old age pension section of the Social Security Act. If they had been successful, there would be no Social Security as we know it today. More recently, in 2005, President George W. Bush and congressional Republicans made privatizing Social Security one of their top policy priorities. These are just two examples. We need to remember our history and examine what the consequences of those proposals might have been so that we can analyze future proposals properly and make sure our actions do not prevent our constituents from retiring with dignity, with the basics they need to live a decent life. Dr. Ghilarducci, what do you think would have happened if Republicans were successful in privatizing Social Security a few years before the financial crisis and the Great Recession?
People would have withdrawn from their Social Security system, and 10 years later, they would not have had the annuities to fall back on. The only logical prediction would have been more poverty in old age and more stress for families, even if they weren't old. But I want to point out that what you could do today is to make sure that you expand coverage. We know, we all agree, Andrew, all of us agree, if you start early in the financial market, you will be better off. But if Congress sets up a system where people can take out money during their lives in divorces and recessions, you have provided emergency savings money. Congress has not provided retirement security. So do what all of our other countries, our peers do, Australia, the Netherlands, the UK, build an advanced funded system on top of the Social Security system and leave that money in. But people need to have not financial education in 4th grade, but they need a safe place to invest that money. So accumulate it, invest it well, and deaccumulate it in a safe way.
Thank you. Well, I'd love to talk to you about adding a level beyond our current Social Security system that's universal, national, that every worker and employer can pay into without friction. But let me, in my little time remaining, let me ask you a question, Dr. Rhee. You know, occupational segregation so often results in people of color working in jobs that do not offer retirement savings plans. So I'd like to ask you to discuss how that factors into the disparities that you highlighted in your testimony.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of money in the 401k and IRA system. Most of the IRAs, which are individual retirement accounts, actually are rollovers from the 401k system. So basically it requires participating in an employer-sponsored plan to save for retirement. And that's just human behavior. And the evidence clearly shows that workers of color in particular have difficulty accessing it and basically wind up with no retirement savings, right? Most Latino and Black households have no retirement savings. They're not seeing it. So there may have been increases, but if you just look at who has any and what those balances are, it's just woefully inadequate. And this is why we need to actually make sure in one way or another to have universal coverage, right? Either through the employer-sponsored system or through a complementary system, which is what the UK NEST program does.
Thank you so much. And not only for that great answer, but being so brief that you answered in the time I had. All right. Now I'd like to have the honor of recognizing the ranking member of our full committee, Dr. Fox. Dr. Fox, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Levin. That's a very nice way to introduce it. Dr. Biggs, you explained in your testimony that retirement savings increased dramatically upon the introduction of a defined contribution in individual account plans like the 401k. Can you describe further how these plans have helped millions of Americans save for retirement and why they're so important to American workers and their families?
Well, thanks very much, Congresswoman Fox. I think in these kinds of hearings and discussions, I find it very interesting. We're often talking about, say, like, as we transition from traditional defined benefit pensions into 401ks, so-and-so, good or bad things might happen. It's worth noting participation in defined benefit pensions peaked at something like 39% of the private sector workforce in 1975. I think we are far enough along now to know what's going to happen here. The 401k was introduced in 1979, started growing in the 1980s. If you look at a chart in my testimony that looks at Federal Reserve data on total retirement savings, you can see there's an inflection point there, where savings in IRAs and 401ks start shooting up. And that helps explain why total retirement savings today are literally 7 times higher than they were in the 1970s. Now that money has got to go somewhere, and it's not all going to the rich. So it's the 401ks worked because first, more employers are willing to offer a 401k than a traditional pension. That means more opportunities to save. Second, 401ks have contributions from both the worker and the employer, while traditional pensions had just the employer. So that's two parties paying in, not just one. Third, 401ks vest almost immediately. Traditional pensions has much stricter vesting requirements. In his opening statement, the chairman noted that employees may switch jobs 12 times over their career. For that employee, a defined benefit pension would be a disaster, because they'd be failing to vest, then failing to vest, then failing to vest. They wouldn't get any money back. We already see this in the public sector, where there's still defined benefit pensions. Employees who shift around early in their careers get nothing. It's only the full career employees who get that. In the private sector, that doesn't exist anymore. We're switching around. So we need a flexible system that allows people to save, take their savings with them. If you're a mom and you take time out of the workforce with a 401k, that money still earns interest while you're caring for your kids, and you come back in, transfer it to a new plan. If you had a traditional pension, you might fail to vest in your benefit and get nothing. So it's,
Well,
we really
you've
have
answered,
world.
You've answered two questions for me in that explanation. I appreciate it. Earlier this year, Dr. Biggs, congressional Democrats enacted an $86 billion taxpayer bailout of failing multi-employer pension plans under the guise of COVID-19 relief. Mismanaged multi-employer pension plans were failing to keep their promises to retirees long before the pandemic. Unlike previous Democrat proposals to provide, quote, loans, end quote, to these plans, their taxpayer-funded handout will not have to be repaid. Dr. Biggs, I'm concerned my Democrat colleagues believe they've somehow solved the problems facing multi-employer pension plans. Do you believe that simply throwing taxpayer money at these plans will help workers and retirees in long term? What changes should this committee and Congress consider to address the chronic mismanagement and underfunding plaguing these plans? And I have one more question I'd like to get in.
Well, you made the important point that all along, the assistance to multi-employer plans was framed in terms of loans. They need some help to get over the hump. We're going to give them some money, they'll pay it back. And then in the reconciliation bill, boom, the loans are gone. They're grants that no longer need to be repaid. This happened very quickly. As far as I can see, not much justification for it. Now, the cost estimated so far is around $86 billion. That may well go up, because the total unfunded liabilities for multi-employer plans are 786 billion, something like that. And the plans will try to act strategically. These are not well-run plans where the trustees, which is employers and the unions, have not acted as good stewards for the employees.
Right.
And so if these were single employer plans, they would be taken over by the PBGC. They would be frozen, so they're not continuing to promise new benefits. We threw all of that out. And I think we just really need to rethink how we handle this.
And with respect to my colleague from Michigan, who was so nice to me, having more government type plans like this isn't going to solve the problem. I want you to talk a little bit about the Secure Act and how programs have built on the progress of Secure Act and expands retirement plan coverage, especially workers employed by small businesses, in terms of their being able to band together as quickly as you can.
We talked earlier about
the gentleman's time has expired, so please answer quite briefly.
Okay, we talked earlier about the difficulty small businesses have starting retirement plans, the fixed costs that are there for them. What the Secure Act did for small employers, and Secure Act 2 did for nonprofits, is let them band together to create multiple employer plans. And those are different from the ones we just bailed out. But what would happen here is it spreads those fixed worth over a larger group of companies and makes it easier for them to do this. So I think that was a really worthy addition.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your patience. I'm very grateful to you.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to point out for the record that I've changed jobs at least 12 times myself, and I have vested in 2 pension plans, and they're awesome. And I'm super grateful that I will have that income in my retirement. So let me now call on the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Mervan, who's next on the list. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you very much. Union members typically have greater access to retirement savings plans than their non-union counterparts. They also participate in these plans at a far greater rate than non-unionized workers. This is a part of what's referred to as the union advantage. In fact, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 91% of union workers have access to private sector retirement benefits, and 85% of the union workers participate in retirement plans. Meanwhile, 65% of non-union workers have access to private sector retirement benefits, and only 51% of non-unionized workers participate in plans. Dr. Rhee, do you think an increase in unionized workers might help address the disparities you mentioned in your testimony regarding access to the participation rates in private sector retirement plans, particularly among women and people of color?
So absolutely. Thank you so much for bringing this up. So insofar as workers of color have a retirement plan, whether it's a pension or 401k, it actually is disproportionately through the unionized sectors of the economy. And I also want to, with regard to women and pensions, I also want to actually highlight they're more likely to have defined benefit pensions versus 401ks. They're just more likely to have more retirement savings. And I like to say that in terms of the households that are doing okay or well in terms of retirement readiness, you're either in the top 20% income bracket or you have a pension. With regard to women and pensions, it's particularly important because of the life expectancy issue. And if you look at data for current retirees, it's the women who used to be teachers who have the best retirement incomes. It's because they have that nice chunky pension income to supplement Social Security. So both pensions and unionization are absolutely critical for both workers of color having retirement security and women having retirement security.
Thank you. Dr. Ghilarducci, your testimony indicates that fewer than 15% of the workforce has a secure defined benefit pension plan now. But back in the 1970s, all workers with a retirement plan had a defined benefit plan. Do you think there is a relationship between the decline in union density in our country over the past 40 years and the decline of traditional defined benefit plans?
Definitely. Unions didn't just get pension plans for themselves, they got the plans for their spouses, and also the spillover effect of other employers mimicking what was the norm in those industries. So when the auto workers got a defined benefit plan, the salary workers wanted it as well as the auto parts and the local department store. We saw this all over the Midwest, and I'm happy to see someone from Indiana. I miss it a lot. The point is that what Representative Levin said, that really does obviate what Andy said, is that having multiple defined benefit plans adds up, because by the time that you get to retirement, whether for your spouse, from your own work, it adds up to income for the rest of your life. I think we could all agree here, I'm hearing it, that everyone needs access to a plan they can save for at the early on. I really commend you to look at my Kevin Hassett, the Republican, and my plan to offer a TSP-like plan to everybody. To start, and we would look like the rest of other countries, and we would really fulfill the promise that the 401k failed. The 401k plan is a failure. Coverage hasn't expanded, and most of the benefits have gone to the top.
Very quickly, if I may have one follow-up, and how would enacting legislation like the PRO Act, which strengthens workers' ability to organize and collectively bargain, help workers' retirement security?
Oh, it would actually multiply. I think every one new union member, the PRO Act would help, would add 3 more people to a pension plan. So the multiplier for a union plan is about 1 to 3. So the PRO Act would provide retirement security.
Thank you, Doctor. With that, Chairman, I yield back my time.
Thanks, Mr. Mervan. Well, Dr. Ghilarducci, Indiana is very well represented here, because I'm next going to recognize another gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Banks, and then I believe I'll turn back the gavel to our chairman who's returned. So Mr. Banks, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Biggs, the issue of reuniting missing participants with their savings is a growing problem. Plan sponsors often incur heavy costs searching to find up-to-date information to connect these individuals with their retirement accounts. I'm wondering if you think that
It all worked out.
would electronic delivery of retirement plan documents enhance portability by allowing individuals to easily update their contact information or monitor their savings accounts after changing jobs? I hope you heard that. I think I briefly was interrupted there, but if you got the gist of that, Dr. Biggs, if you could talk about how you reunite missing participants with their savings using enhanced portability, would appreciate it.
Yes, I did. The issue of lost accounts is a problem associated with one of 401k's main advantages. 401k's are portable in ways that traditional pensions never were, which means that when you leave a job during one of these 12 job changes that we think the average person will have, those savings don't go away, they go with you. One problem, though, is some of these accounts get lost. The Social Security Administration, where I formerly worked, did some research where they found something like 1 in 6 workers who participate in a retirement plan. If you ask them whether they participate in the retirement plan, they will tell you that they don't. Yeah. They may be unaware. We don't know exactly what happens, but they leave, and then if they don't leave a forwarding address or whatever happens, and the account gets disconnected from them. So the issue is, how do we reconnect these? And there's proposals now of having a centralized database running the Treasury or PBGC, and so when a retirement plan sponsor has these lost accounts, they have to go do their due diligence to find the person. If they can't, then they report the account to the database. The issue, I think, is what happens to the account, who holds it. I would prefer that it continue to stay and earn interest, since a lot of these accounts, the lost accounts, are from younger workers. You want them to stay invested, not get shifted to Treasury bonds or something. But then you have the question of, how do you try to reconnect with these people? And there's one question: do you do it by paper or do you do it electronically? I suspect today that electronically is an easier way of doing it. I know I've done work on the Social Security statement, which is a paper statement people would get. Often people would get that and they look at it and it goes in the trash. If you get an email from your employer trying to find you, that's something you can search on in your email. It saves it for you in that way. You can access it more easily. So I tend to favor electronic communication with people, because I just think it's an easier way of reaching people today. And it's easier for them to get back in touch with you via a link to the internet. So I think this is doable, but it is a challenge associated with one of the main plus points of 401k plans.
So sticking with that, Dr. Biggs, nearly 15 million American workers who save for their retirement through a defined contribution plan change jobs every year. These workers deserve to keep the money they previously saved for retirement, but far too often, they're unable to locate their hard-earned investments. I know there are private sector solutions that exist to ensure some missing participants maintain balances in an IRA that are not cashed out. Can you talk a little bit about about some of the hurdles that people face when they're trying to roll their money over, and as policymakers, what we can do to make that process easier?
Sure. Well, one of the problems that often happens with small account balances, less than $1,000, is that when you leave your job, the employer will simply issue you a check. Now, in theory, you could take that check, reinvest it in an IRA, maintain the savings, maintain the tax preference. But as we've seen in general, people don't do it. They see a check and they just cash it, and those savings are then lost. So it's the issue is, how do you find a way to keep that money invested? And so I think looking at the ideas of the databases there are private sector firms already that handle these small accounts. I think we want to look more closely at that, but it's keeping the money invested. A lot of young folks, for the same reasons you don't sign up for a retirement plan in the first place, you're busy, you're distracted, you may be changing jobs, you may be changing homes or cities. We're human beings, and things tend to fall by the wayside. But going back, I think electronic communications is a great way of handling this, because electronically we can find you everywhere these days. Your mailing address may change, your email address won't. And so that's an easier way of overcoming some of these hurdles that we've seen in the past.
Very good. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative. And I want to recognize, well, first I want to thank Annie for stepping in, and then I wanted to recognize the representative from Michigan, Ms. Stevens, for 5 minutes. You are recognized.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. For years, workers, retirees, and participating businesses have been waiting for Congress to deliver a solution to the multi-employer pension crisis. And I am more than thrilled and delighted to have been involved in that and delivering that fix through the American Rescue Plan Act, which provided financial relief to the multi-employer pensions and over 1.3 million hardworking Americans whose very livelihoods were hanging in the balance while we were waiting for Congress to fix this. The Central States Pension Fund is no longer at risk of being insolvent. That is where we are today. And now over 43,000 Michiganders will have the retirement security that they deserve. Over 260 businesses that serve as the lifeline for Michigan's economy no longer face increased liabilities that put jobs at risk. And Dr. Ghilarducci, could you speak about the importance of passing this crucial fix and what consequences may have been had Congress not have acted?
Yes, if those multi-employer plans had not been bailed out, the areas of the country where the devastation would have laid because these workers would not have incomes was very concentrated in the industrial Midwest, in the South, and in spotted communities. So notwithstanding the fact that these families would go from being lower middle class to poverty and then rely on Medicaid and all sorts of poor relief. They'd be middle class, go to welfare, tragedy for their households. It would have reverberated into their already devastated communities by probably a multiplier of 1.5 to 2.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, I ask for unanimous consent to enter into the record the Central States district sheet for every HELP subcommittee member.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. And then Dr. Ree, in your testimony, you mentioned that workers face an increasing retirement savings burden and that workers of all backgrounds are worried about retirement, including millennials who are now hitting age 40. Could you please expand on why millennials are worried and what the data suggests about their access to and participation in retirement savings plans?
Yes, thank you. So I'm going to reference and submit, because I can't remember the exact statistics, some of the surveys that I've cited in my written testimony. So millennials have had a really rough time, right? So they kind of came of age into the labor market during the 2007-2008 financial crisis and the long recovery from recession that followed. And I think that really sort of influenced their thinking about retirement security. If you look at some of the work done by the National Institute on Retirement Security and their survey work focused on millennials, they found that they're actually very supportive of pensions, right? So it really kind of goes against this image of the free-flowing millennial who's just going to skip from job to job and wants all this flexibility. And I think in some ways, millennials have had flexibility imposed on them by the labor market and economic structure. And at the same time, there actually is this kind of heightened awareness of the risks imposed by the market. And so there actually is worrying and thinking about retirement savings. They are saving for retirement saving when they can. And also there's actually a high level of support for pensions.
Great. Thank you. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'm going to yield back.
Thank you, Representative. Chair now recognizes Representative Fitzgerald for 5 minutes. You are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Biggs, we're all very familiar kind of with automatic enrollment, but Secure Act 2.0 would expand automatic enrollment, obviously, to the 401k plans. What impact does this typically have on the employees? Has there been any analysis done on that, or?
I apologize.
Has anybody looked further?
Mr. Biggs, did you get the gist of that?
I just the gist of it. I think it's about automatic enrollment in 401k plans and the Secure Act. I apologize. The signal was not great. This is automatic enrollment is a great example
that you're aware of, and then what effect does it have actually on employers? I mean, everyone I think assumes that the automatic kind of forced savings is just a great thing for everyone, but I'm wondering if anybody took a little bit longer or harder.
Sure. Okay, going back to late 1990s, a lot of what's now been called behavioral economics research that looked at the effect of defaults on people's behavior. We always assumed that people who needed to save or wanted to save would participate, the people who didn't wouldn't. It turns out that most people do whatever they're defaulted into. If the default is to participate, 70% of people participate. If the default is not, then participation is going to be a lot lower. So you could really influence people's behavior by choosing to make it automatic to participate and sign them up rather than not signing them up. And I think that's it's a great example of how this retirement research that Teresa and Nari and I work in actually is translated into the real world, and that's very encouraging. So as automatic enrollment is adopted, you see greater participation. The question is, how far is that going to go on its own? I personally favor what you see in Secure Act 2.0 of making automatic enrollment sort of default for newly hired employees. It strikes me as the best practice just to sign people up. And there are low-income people who don't need to save, where it's a little more problematic. But by and large, I think that's going to be a good policy. The issue that I think you're getting at is what happens beyond that. If an employer is making a match to their employees' 401ks and participation goes from 50% to 100% of their workforce, just for instance, the cost the employer is going to increase. And the question is, how are they going to handle that? Are they going to offset that? Are they going to lower the match rate? Are they going to offset it against health benefits, lower wages, or whatever? I mean, that's the standard kind of economic logic. But there's also the issue of how will sort of lower income people who are automatically enrolled in a plan, how will that affect their sort of total savings? There is some evidence that looked at automatic enrollment in the federal government that by and large it increased savings for less educated workers, though. They increased savings in their TSP plan, but debts and assets outside of it tended to decline. So which goes to show that, you can lead a horse to water, it's hard to make them drink. If they are really low income and they're thinking about putting food on the table or, sending their kids to summer camp or buying shoes for their kids, it's a tougher proposition. So I think by and large, automatic enrollment is a worthy thing. It's a great innovation, but we shouldn't think that just all our solutions lie in that. Life is more complicated for people, and they're going to try to make choices to make their lives as best they can. And often we in government or policymakers can't foresee that accurately. So we just want to be modest about our claims there.
Very good, very good. Thank you very much for that answer. Just real quick then, too, the other thing I hear when I'm in the district and you visit with a small, business employer, and they're frustrated, I think, sometimes because they say, listen, I want to be a good employer. I want to set up a retirement account for the employees that work for me. But quite honestly, the cost of it and the regulations involved that we have to work towards meeting are too much. And as a result of that, they never really can successfully launch that retirement program. And is there anything that we could do as members of Congress to lessen that or change that dynamic?
Well, this is an area where I feel a little worried about the introduction of the state-based automatic IRA plans. Like Dr. Reed mentioned, Cal Savers. I live in the state of Oregon. We have Oregon Saves. On the one hand, you have small employers who are thinking they'd like to offer a retirement plan for their employees, but there's cost to them and increasingly there's legal liabilities to doing it. So they wonder what they're getting themselves into. And they still might have done it, but if they see the automatic IRA plan, they may say, let's just put the employee into that instead. The issue, though, is a 401k is a much better retirement savings vehicle than an IRA. First, because you can have an employer match in it, and second, because the savings limits are much higher than with IRAs. So I'm a little afraid we've set up this situation where small employers see some problems setting up their own retirement plan. They see an easy out. Hey, let's just put them in the state plan. The state plan isn't as good as a 401k. So I think we want to think both about what the state plans or some of the federal version of them can offer, but also think, how do we really make this easy on smaller employers? Secure Act 1 and Secure Act 2 are movement in that direction to make it lower cost and hopefully lower risk for them.
Thank you, Mr. Biggs. Mr. Fitzgerald, your time's up. Any concluding thoughts? No. All right. The chair will now recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes of questions. Mr. Allen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Biggs, you stated in your testimony that more Americans are saving for retirement than ever before. More employers are offering retirement plans than ever before. And of course, we had that experience in our own company. And employees are saving more in these plans than ever before. This is great news. And I believe we can build on this success. What more can this committee and Congress do to increase the number of small businesses providing retirement plans for their workers? And how can we reduce the cost and the regulatory issues? I know that's one thing that we faced and was, all the, the legal and other aspects you have to deal with in setting these things up. What can we do to reduce the cost of providing these plans to our employees?
Well, the facts that you point out on participation retirement plans, contributions, savings levels, number of retirees getting benefits, the reason why I push back so hard on the sort of retirement crisis meme that comes out, there's this idea that we're entering some apocalyptic period of retirement, is because it'll cause us to ignore all the progress we've made and forget that what we really have in a lot of ways is kind of a mopping up operation. We need to say, where are the gaps in the current 401k system or other retirement plans? How do we fill those gaps? If we have this sort of retirement crisis claims, people might say, let's just throw the whole thing out. But the reality is the whole thing has worked remarkably well at improving retirement savings. In my testimony, I point out US retirement savings relative to other countries, very high. I point out, Americans' ability to maintain their pre-retirement standard of living when they retire, much better than in Europe that has these much more centralized sort of ways of doing things. So we have to remember our successes. We also want to say, where are the shortcomings? The shortcomings, I think, are largely in the small employer community. Whereas we've talked about before, the fixed costs of setting up a plan are higher relative to the number of employees who are going to be served. And second, the legal liabilities are just much more daunting. If you're a large employer, you can handle those things pretty easily. And almost all of them today are offering a plan. If you're a small employer, it's much harder. So I think we really need to think about, first, lowering costs and protecting its legal liabilities for small employers. But we also, I think, realistically need to think about if there are alternatives for people in those employers, when the employers just aren't up to, they're running a taco stand or something like that. If running a 401k is not what they can do, what other alternatives? That may be state plans or a federal version of that.
And perhaps for just individuals, that some type of incentive to do this. Dr. Biggs, according to the most recently available PBGC data, the multi-employer pension plans are collectively underfunded by $673 billion. Now, I said in my own opening statement that we're dependent on the taxpayer, or at least the Democrats passed the American Rescue Plan, and we took supposedly taxpayer money and to the tune of $86 billion to extend that that plan process. Right now, obviously, all of this money that's being spent is we're maintaining our standard of living on the backs of generations of Americans. I mean, there may be 4, 5, 6 generations as this debt mounts up. And so what do you see right now if we said, okay, what is actually staring us in the face? I think you mentioned $4 trillion that of unfunded mandates that we have right now. And is that the entirety of it?
It's never the entirety.
Yeah.
I think with a multi-employer issue, we should have been honest with ourselves and with the American people all along. For decades, the American people were told, the PBGC is self-funding. There's no liability on the federal government, no obligation on the federal government to pay anything. The multi-employer participants, if one withdraws or goes bankrupt, the others are going to bail it out. And because of that, they don't have to use strict accounting rules. They can kind of cowboy it. And then we said, oh, well, these are not going to be bailout. These are going to be loans. All of that at its core was not honest. I mean, it just, you had to know that politically speaking, if these plans go under, the federal government's going to bail them out. Just as at the end of the day, we're going to bail out the Illinois firefighters because we'll say they don't deserve to get hit. The key, though, is first, how do we manage these plans and regulate them so we don't end up in that situation? And people were warned about this for decades. They refused to do it because there was a political cost. But second, when we go to a solution, I mean, maybe, and I wasn't against any financial assistance for the multi-employer pensions, but to say this is all people who are getting welfare or Medicaid, a third of the folks at Central States were getting more than $3,000 a month on top of Social Security. These were generous pensions. You could have trimmed them somewhat while maintaining the benefits at the bottom, cut the cost to the taxpayer. And that would have been, I think, a more responsible approach to this than simply saying, we are going to cut a check for $86 billion and whatever it ends up being and call it solved. I mean, to be honest, if my 401k drops when I'm about to retire, where's my $86 billion? I'm a taxpayer too. I'm an American too. Why does one group of Americans get treated so much better? The answer is political power. We know that. But it's just, let's be good regulators about this. Let's think about these plans seriously, be responsible about it.
Exactly. Point well taken. And thank you so much for your testimony. I thank all the witnesses, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. That is the last individual of the subcommittee that I have who wishes to speak. So again, I want to thank the panelists, and we'll go to closing comments in just a second. And just a little housekeeping for materials submitted for the hearing record. Pursuant to committee practice, materials for submission for the hearing record must be submitted to the committee clerk within 14 days following the last day of the hearing. So by close of business on July 7th, preferably in Microsoft Word format. Only a member of the subcommittee or an invited witness may submit materials for inclusion into the hearing record, and the materials must address the subject matter of the hearing. Please submit materials to the committee clerk electronically by emailing submissions to edenlabor.hearings@mail.house.gov. Witness questions for the hearing record. Again, I want to thank the witnesses. You were terrific. Lots to digest and to continue in the conversation. I very much appreciate your contributions today. Members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for you, and we ask that you please respond to those questions in writing. The hearing record will be held open for 14 days in order to receive those responses. I want to remind my colleagues that pursuant to committee practices, witness questions for the hearing record, again, must be submitted to the majority committee staff or committee clerk within 7 days. The questions submitted must be addressed the subject matter of the hearing. And now for closing statements, we'll go back to Mr. Allen for the ranking member's closing statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I'd like to thank our witnesses for participating in this important discussion this morning. I'd like to also note that, folks in Georgia and across the country work very hard so they can enjoy a comfortable and meaning retirement. Bipartisan updates to ERISA can help our constituents in many ways. We can simplify and reduce the cost of administering retirement plans. We can expand the number of retirement options available to small business employees. And we can boost access to defined contribution plans for workers. Taxpayer funded bailouts of outdated multi-employer pension plans are an irresponsible and unsustainable solution. We must fix this. We must also focus on pro-growth economic policies to help more Americans succeed in the long term. And I'll say it again, I believe there is room for bipartisanship in the months ahead. Thank you again to all the witnesses for participating in today's hearing and sharing your expertise. I look forward to working with all of you to ensure a strong American retirement system. And Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. It's always terrific to work with you, and I appreciate the fact that we can respect our differences, but work to a common goal, which this institution sometimes is very hard to get. So appreciate your friendship.
Yes, sir.
And I now recognize myself for the purpose of a closing statement. Again, I want to thank the panelists. Terrific presentation. Really look forward to continued conversation. I want to thank all my colleagues who spent time and joined us on this important subject matter. I do want to talk about one thing we didn't talk about in the three-legged stool is home ownership and moral hazard and appropriate congressional action to make sure that we have an appropriate risk assessment. I'm very involved in state and local government, both with CalPERS and my own county, 37 Act County here in California. And clearly we did some things. We assumed that our actuaries sometimes were too aggressive in terms of our rate of return. And of course, that's what we want, one of the things we want to address. So in terms of responsibility, we should remember that, as Madison famously said, if humans were angels, there'd be no need for government. And this is one of those areas, I think, whether it's in the financial service industry and what happened in the housing industry, where so many people, particularly people who are disadvantaged by this economy. And Mr. Biggs, I appreciate your comments. I don't want to be Pollyannish, but I also think it's irresponsible not to recognize the sort of Dickens aspect of some of the challenges we have, that if you're a poor person, particularly a poor person of color, it's and your wages are limited, it's harder. Also, completely agree with the small business argument. When I did 401ks and was able to afford it as a restaurant owner, if I had a dime for every time one of my younger employees said, I'd rather you just give me the money rather than put it in whatever this is. So it's daunting. But I think we should be proportionate and be mindful about all of the risk and reinforce a responsible management and responsible risk assessment by the managers of these retirement plans, irrespective of what their legal structure is, and also not have selective amnesia about risk assessments and moral hazards in financial institutions, because they're clearly intertwined, and particularly intertwined when it comes to home ownership, which we know is an important part historically of that third pillar. Sorry to digress, but I wanted to bring that up. Also wanted to thank and just remind folks that accepting some of the criticism, we have a different perspective on our legislation to help save those multi-employer plans, and that we did have support from ARP, the AFL-CIO, the National Association of Manufacturers, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and scores of other stakeholders who supported our efforts. So evidence-based research, Mr. Allen, you brought that up, and I'm all in on that. So let's continue to do that. Today's hearing also confirmed how vital and necessary pensions are to Californians, my home state, and all Americans. It highlighted the challenge and inequities in private sector retirement system, particularly as it relates to access to and participation in employer-provided plans. And we have a lot of work to do. I appreciated the witnesses' analysis of the Secure Act 2.0. The Education and Labor Committee is expected to mark up the bill in the coming months, and look forward to more communication with all of my colleagues as we lead up to that. And I also look forward to the fact that we must not stop there. We must continue to prioritize and enact other policies that boost workers' wages, strengthen Social Security, and make it easier for American workers to organize and collectively bargain for their best interest, and also be respectful of employers. I look forward to working with all of my colleagues on these important issues. If there's no further business, thank you all again. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned. Thank you all.